This is an overview of chapters 3 through 7 in our textbook. It's designed not to make you an expert in any of these, but just to introduce you to the chapters so that you're able to complete the rhetorical analysis assignment that comes from chapter 8. Here's a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today. Most of this is contained in our textbook in part 2, which is a section that our textbook calls Writing Arguments. Chapter 3 discusses what the nature of an argument is. Chapter 4 talks about the structure of arguments. Chapter 5 talks about evidence. Chapter 6 talks about moving an audience, that is, appeal to pathos. Chapter 7 talks about alternative perspectives. And this all leads to chapter 8, where we're going to focus on critiquing an argument or performing what we call rhetorical analysis. That chapter will be the subject of a separate video. We're going to get into types of claims and logical fallacies when we get into argument itself. This is our friend, the rhetorical triangle again. You've seen this before in the introduction to argument video that I made. You can see that there are 3 parts, as usual: the message, the audience, and the writer. And we talk about each of these in terms of different appeal types, establishing our ethos, establishing our credibility as a writer. Our message has to be a logical, reasoned claim with evidence to support it. Those are appeals to logos, which we'll talk about in a sec. And then how we bring our audience in, that is how we make appeals to pathos. So we'll keep coming back to these terms over the rest of the course. An argument, as you know from our earlier discussion, is a claim with reasons. A claim is a stated position that you, the writer, takes, and these claims fall into different claim types, and those are covered in chapters 10 through 14. And like I say, we'll get to that probably in week 5. The reason that we take the position that we do, those are supporting ideas, and those are based on evidence. And evidence as a thing is discussed in chapter 5. Arguments, again, rely on 3 different kinds of appeals: logos, ethos, and pathos. These come from Aristotle, a Greek philosopher from the 4th century BC. A little bust of him over here to the right. In fact, most of our Western notions of argument come from him. He wrote the very first rhetoric book called Rhetoric in the 4th century BC, and we've been developing variations on that ever since. Logos is probably the most lasting appeal type. Logic is the one that works the best. The one that we respond most emotionally to, pathos, is one that's effective, but only for a very short time. And I'll be discussing that over the next few slides. Logos, again, appeals to logic or reason. Ethos has to do with the credibility of author, the trust that you establish. There's a variety of different ways you can do that. Pathos is appealing to audience beliefs and emotions, not in a cheap, sensational kind of way, but rather in a way that engages them and brings them into the discussion, makes them feel that they have some stake in the debate. And again, we'll be talking about that as we go over the next few weeks. Most arguments, however, rely on a mix of these. They don't rely just on one. So as we examine different kinds of arguments, you're going to see that there are different appeal types displayed in those arguments in order to make them effective. I've got a couple of examples posted to Blackboard of one particular appeal type. They're military recruiting videos. And I include those in part because you should be familiar with them. Many of you have talked to recruiters when you were in high school, or you've seen recruiting videos online, or maybe in a classroom somebody's shown you one. I used to approve recruiting videos, posters, and other materials for the Army when I worked in the Pentagon in 1992 to 1995. I worked on an earlier version of what you see now as Army Strong commercials, when the Army had a very different advertising agency. And my job was to make sure that we didn't promise prospective soldiers more than we could deliver in terms of benefits. But there's a couple of things you can see here from this one small poster. First, we have an African American. Second, we have a woman. These are 2 areas that we have trouble recruiting in the military. We retain women actually at a pretty high rate, and we retain African American women at something like 4 times the rate of white women and white men, which is really kind of interesting. When we survey African American women, we find that they stay in the military because they're paid the same as men, they get the same respect, the same rank, the same supervisory responsibilities as men, and they get a large group of benefits, child care, medical, dental coverage, things like that, housing, that really make a difference for them. These are things that are not available to many civilians. So there's some logical reasons why this particular woman is in here. There's also some appeals to pathos in here in the sense that we're appealing to this idea of people being strong, people being physically strong, mentally strong, emotionally strong. And these are all things that we think are valuable for soldiers to have. So you can see here how two different appeal types, logos and pathos, show in this particular one. People want to be thought of as strong, not weak. So we're trying to attract people here who feel that they are strong people. Logos is a very different kind of appeal type. And I'll be discussing logic as a thing later on when we get to the argument part. But for now, you just need to know that logic comes in two different forms. It comes in deductive form, which is classical argument, and it comes in inductive. The differences are quite clear. Deductive is where we have some kind of a general principle and we apply it to a specific case or a specific example. Inductive is actually more common in the basis of an argument, which is we assemble a series of examples, we assemble a series of facts, and from that we draw some kind of generalized conclusion. We use deduction a lot in classification, in deciding what general principle might apply to a specific example. Does something fit into something else? Inductive we use when we're not quite sure what we're thinking about, and we assemble a series of examples, facts, kinds of evidence into a large pile, and then we draw some kind of conclusion from it. I'll be talking about that over the next few weeks, but for now I think you just need to know that logic is a vital appeal type, and it comes in two different forms. Evidence is an interesting kind of thing because evidence comes in a variety of different forms, and some evidence is more persuasive than others. Our textbook lists out what they call the STAR criteria, that all evidence needs to meet these four tests. There has to be enough of it, sufficiency. The evidence has to be fairly common across various sources. That's what we mean by typicality. The evidence has to be accurate in that it's got to be true, and it's got to be relevant in the sense that a body of facts applies to a specific topic. Our textbook lists different kinds of evidence drawn from personal experience, which is compelling, but is also the weakest because it's only one person's point of view. It's only one person's experience. I had a student years ago who wrote a paper on breastfeeding where she said, oh my God, we should stop breastfeeding. And she based it entirely on one article she read by one woman who had difficulty breastfeeding. And I said, have you ever heard of La Leche League, which is a large group of women who are big supporters of breastfeeding? She said, no. And I said, well, there's literally hundreds of thousands of women who belong to this who feel very differently about breastfeeding. I said, also, humans are mammals. I mean, one of the characteristics of mammals is that we suckle our young. If it were so difficult, if it were so impossible, it wouldn't have reached this point evolutionarily speaking. I said, yes, one person might struggle, many people might struggle, but certainly the majority of people do not, women I should say, do not struggle with breastfeeding. So I said, you're really making an argument that's based only on one person's experience, on one narrative, and that's not a very good basis for an argument. Other kinds of evidence might be data from observation. This could be from experiments that you've done. It could be experiments that other people have done. It could be studies. Interviews, you can interview experts, and that's one of the categories, of course, on your annotated bibliography, is that an other source could be someone you feel is an expert. Library sources, these are the articles that you found from databases, the articles that you might have found online, Googling around. You can look for testimony, and this could be by somebody who's experienced. It could also be a story or a narrative report done by a group of scientists over a particular issue. Statistical data, that of course is numbers. That's almost the best kind of evidence because we're always convinced more by numbers than anything else. Hypothetical examples, these are a little bit more complicated. These are kind of what if cases. If we allowed X to happen, what might be the logical result of that? And these are speculative. Some people like to use them, some people don't. Sometimes they fit, sometimes they don't into a case. But you should consult Chapter 5 for further discussion of that. And then a reasoned sequence of ideas. This is actually a form of an appeal to logos, where you have a series of ideas that logically connect from one point to another. All of these can be kinds of evidence. All of these have different values, different weights, different importance in the body of a paper. But what you're looking for when you're looking at somebody else's article is you're looking for these kinds of things. Is it just one person's story? Are there statistics to back it up? Is this person presenting him or herself as typical of a larger group of people? This is the kind of stuff you have to look for in order to analyze someone else's argument. Ethos, this is one of the other appeal types, and this is where you establish your own credibility. And these are the kinds of things that you need to include if you're going to do that. Your source should show some mastery of facts. It should show a fair presentation of the issue. It should show fair presentation of the alternatives. It shouldn't use any inflammatory language or call the other side by negative terms. It should present them as merely alternatives that may not work as well as the writer's alternative. It should also show some respect for the shared values that the audience and the writer should have. And it also should demonstrate some level of professionalism. This is why a lot of students say, why do I have to worry about grammar and spelling so much? I mean, that's not that important. Well, it is, because if people can't trust you in small things, they're not going to be able to trust you in big things either. And the same thing applies to the sources that you use. If you see grammar, spelling errors of awkward sentences, things like that, you've got to think about the trustworthiness of that person as a writer. Can we rely on them if they can't do simple things like not make comma splices or spell words incorrectly? Pathos is including audience beliefs and values in the source's thinking, and making sure that the argument is one that audiences will like to read. And it's not just appealing to emotions necessarily, but it's rather appealing to them in specific kinds of ways. Here we have an example of one. We have this little dog pit bull over here in a cage. And then we have a fact. 1 in 600 pit bulls find a forever home. 599 are killed. This works in two ways. On the one hand, this is a fact. This is an appeal to logos. But the data presented showing that by far the vast majority of pit bulls are euthanized, that's an appeal to pathos in the sense that we're saying, oh my God, this is a terrible tragedy that all these dogs have to die and only one of these 600 are going to get placed. So you've got an interesting combination here. We tend to think of pathos as, give money or this child is going to die, but it's really a little bit more complex than that. This is a much better appeal to pathos, in the sense that audience beliefs and values, maybe we don't believe that animals should be euthanized just because they're not easy to adopt. Let's move on to opposing or alternative views. This is covered in Chapter 7. Any good argument is going to contain some discussion of alternative points of view. And so you should look for that. Make sure that they're not what our textbook calls a one-sided argument or a pseudo-argument, but they're ones that include alternative perspectives in a fair way. If you see that, you should also look for some kind of refutation of saying, well, this is an alternative, but it's not going to work because, or this is an alternative, but I don't think it's as good as mine. It has some good parts, but not as many good parts as mine do. And you've also got to look for some kind of understanding of what kind of audience resistance you're going to find. If you look at the two arguments that we have in Chapter 8, you're going to see that one of those arguments, the Catherine Jean Lopez one, does not really consider that aspect of this very much at all. She makes certain assumptions about her audience that color the way that her essay shows. One of the last things to think about in these chapters is the forms that you could choose for an argument. You can choose a one-sided argument. You can choose where you just present one side, one perspective, because you assume you and the audience agree. If you and the audience are far apart on a topic, And it could be something like, I don't know, baking cakes for gay marriage by bakers who oppose them over religious views. And whatever side you're on that, my sense is that you and your audience are going to be in very different places. And so you can write what's called a dialogic argument. There's an example of that in chapter 8, one written by uh, the one written by Ellen Goodman, Womb for Rent, is a dialogic argument. A classical argument, the classic 7-part argument, we'll be talking about here a little bit later in the next video, but it's one that's perhaps the most common, and this is one that you'll be using, or you should expect to see, where the audience and the writer see each other as neutral or they're uninformed. Okay. Our last thing our textbook talks about is this idea of pseudo-arguments. Unfortunately, these are the kind of arguments that you run into on Facebook. You run into a lot of political arguments about this. These are ones where basically members of a tribe are attacking members of another tribe, or they're establishing their own bona fides as members of a tribe. Our textbook calls these folks committed believers. And they tend to be read by what our textbook calls fanatical skeptics, that is, people who agree with him. These are extreme arguments. These are ones where there's really no real context or point of agreement between the audience and the writer. The audience for these things tend to be the same folks who were writing them, but they simply lack shared assumptions between them and a larger audience. And they rely very heavily on personal opinion. They rely very heavily on very, very, very finely drawn analogies or assertions or claims that many people will just simply not accept. But they don't care because they're really appealing to believers. And I have a couple examples of that later here. This is the first one. This is really an ad. This is one actually from my childhood. The idea here is this is put together by the American Meat Institute, which is a lobbying organization for people to eat more meat. This ad comes from like 1961 or 1962. You can see here a couple of things that's meant to draw us in. First is the red color. Red is a powerful color. It draws us in. We see the meat, pictures of the meat here. And we see the red on the fingernails. We see what's clearly a woman's hand holding them, because back when this was made, women were the cooks. So this is clearly designed to say, oh, eating meat, oh, it's really good for you. It's the best stuff. And it tells you down here, it's a generous supplier of complete protein, the kind of protein children need for growth, the kind we all must have for life itself. As if we don't eat meat, we're all going to die. That's the kind of argument that you find in an ad like this, and it's effective, but it's not as effective as it could be, because it overstates its claim. It doesn't allow for other alternatives like vegetarianisms or vegans, or even people who don't like beef. It says basically, if you don't eat this stuff, your life is over. And so it really is a form of pseudo argument. I use this one because it actually sets up the next slide, which really is a pseudo argument. And this is the last of our slides. And of course, this is Pamela Anderson, who you remember maybe from Baywatch reruns or from other shows that seem to feature her and women who look like her. And this one comes, of course, from the people from the ethical treatment of animals. And the idea here is that we're taking a human being and we're displaying her in the same way that we might see a diagram of a cow or a pig in a butcher shop, where you'll see these sometimes behind the counter at Schnucks or Dierberg's, where they show you what part of the cow or what part of the pig different cuts of meat come from. So of course, that's why she's represented this way. And so this is kind of the antithesis of the previous one. This is one that's making an argument for vegetarianism. And they're using this really sort of compelling image, depending on how you feel about Pamela Anderson, to make their point that human beings have body parts just like cows do or pigs do, and that if we took a human being and ate them, we might consider them in the same kind of way. That we can just simply regard them as something to be consumed. So this is kind of dehumanizing the notion of eating meat by using a human being in a particular kind of way. There's no way to argue with folks who would hold a view like this. This is another kind of pseudo-argument, but it's an argument that argues the opposite point that's made earlier, that somehow human beings and animals are fundamentally equivalent. And since we don't eat human beings, there aren't that many cannibals among us, we ought not to eat animals. So this is kind of where chapter 7 ends, with this idea of arguments that have gone wrong. Arguments that are not really arguments because, again, there's no shared assumptions. There's no shared set of beliefs or values. Instead, it's an extreme position to take, and it's one that really doesn't allow any healthy debate or any discussion. It just says, don't eat this because animals and humans are equivalent. That's the fundamental assumption. And I think that's an assumption that many people would simply not buy. So this concludes this particular slideshow. I have a separate one that discusses chapter 8 itself.